大家好，我是 Jenny， 欢迎来到沉思者 J。 有一个人，他一生都活在失败的阴影里，他被巴黎沙龙拒绝了超过20次。他最亲密的少年好友佐拉，在一部小说里，把他写成一个才华洋溢却一事无成的失败画家。他在故乡艾克斯，被邻居当成怪人，被评论家当成笑话。他终其一生，几乎活在世人的漠视与嘲笑之中。然而，就是这个人，在死后1年，让整个巴黎艺术界目瞪口呆。就是这个人，被毕卡索尊称为所有现代画家的父亲。就是这个人，用一颗普通的苹果，彻底改写了整个西方艺术史的走向。他就是保罗塞尚。今天的故事，从一座法国南部的小城说起。1839年1月19日，保罗塞尚出生在艾克斯普罗旺斯。那是一座充满阳光的中海小城，石灰岩山丘在远处起伏，薰衣草的香气在空气中流动。夏天的光线前燥而炽烈，把每一块岩石、每一片叶子都照得轮廓分明。这座城市的光，后来成了塞尚灵魂的一部分。他的父亲路易奥古斯特塞尚是一个白手起家的商人，从卖帽子起家，后来成为当地一家金融机构的共同创办人。父亲是一个务实的人，对金钱有着清醒的认识，对儿子有着严格的期望。他希望保罗将来成为法律从业人员，能够稳稳当地在社会上立足。然而，保罗从小就显示出一种完全不同的天性。他喜欢在纸上涂画画，喜欢在自然中游荡，喜欢用眼睛而不是算盘去感受世界。在布尔贝学校就读期间，塞尚认识了一个将要深刻改变他命运的人，那个人就是艾米尔·佐拉。佐拉将来会成为法国最伟大的小说家之一，但在那个时候，他们只是2个在艾克斯石板路上奔跑的少年，2个少年的灵魂，奇妙的一拍即合。他们有着相似的敏感，相似的理想，相似的野心。他们一起在河边背诵维吉尔的诗句，一起在田野间追逐蝴蝶，一起在夜晚对着星空说以后要去征服巴黎。这段少年情谊，是塞尚整个漫长而孤独的人生里，最纯粹最温暖的一段时光。然而，幸福总是短暂的。佐拉在1858年就随母亲迁往巴黎了，塞尚留在艾克斯，在父亲的意志下继续读书。2个少年只能靠书信维系友情。那些年的书信，充满了诗意和渴望，和对未来的无限憧憬。1859年，父亲强迫塞尚进入艾克斯大学攻读法律，塞尚沉默地服从了。他坐在法律课堂里，却把课本的每一页空白都画满了图。他的眼睛注视着教授，脑子里却飞翔在颜料和画布的世界里。绘画的冲动，就像地底的火山，压制不住，只是在等待爆发的时机。佐拉在巴黎的书信，像一根根燃烧的火柴，点燃了塞尚心里的渴望。佐拉描述巴黎的一切，咖啡馆的辩论，沙龙的展览，思想的碰撞，艺术的可能。那些文字让塞尚夜不能寐。终于，在1861年，在母亲的暗中支持下，塞尚鼓起勇气说服了父亲。父亲大概认为，让儿子去巴黎碰碰壁，也许是让他死心的最好办法。于是，22岁的保罗塞尚怀揣着满腔热情，第一次踏上了前往巴黎的旅程。然而，巴黎并不像佐拉信中描述的那样温柔。塞尚报考著名的巴黎美术学院，落榜了。他去拜访各路老师，大多数人对他的作品不感兴趣。他试着提交作品给各类沙龙，一次次被拒绝。巴黎美丽而残酷，他对一个来自南方省份的土气青年毫不留情。那年秋天，塞尚垂头丧气地回到了艾克斯。父亲大概在心里暗自松了一口气，以为儿子终于认清了现实。但塞尚的意志比父亲以为的要顽强得多。他在家族农场的一角找了一间小屋，把它改造成画室，继续孤独地作画。他读书、思考、试验、失败，再试验。1862年，他再度前往巴黎。这一次，他没有试图进入那些正统的艺术学院，他选择了一个叫做阿卡德米斯维斯的自由学院。那是一个开放的地方，什么样的艺术家都可以进去画画，互相观摩，互相批评。 在那里，他遇见了卡米耶·毕沙罗。毕沙罗是印象派最重要的人物之一，比塞尚年长整整10岁。他是一个心胸宽阔、眼光独到的艺术家。当许多人嘲笑塞尚那些厚重粗粝、充满张力的笔触时，毕沙罗看见了其中隐藏的力量。他没有嘲笑，他说：“这个人有东西。”这句话对塞尚而言，比任何奖项都珍贵。在毕沙罗的引导下，塞尚开始走到户外去作画。他学着直接观察自然，学着对着真实的光线和色彩思考。毕沙罗带着他去庞特瓦兹一带的田野间写生，两个人肩并肩站在田野里，对着同一个景物，各自在画布上探索。这段时光是塞尚艺术转型最重要的催化剂之一。1870年代，印象派在巴黎掀起了一场真正的革命。克劳德·莫内在户外捕捉光与空气的瞬间，皮耶·奥古斯特·雷诺瓦描绘阳光下欢笑的人群，阿弗列德·希斯莱在河流旁追逐倒影的颤动。这群年轻的画家打破了几百年来西方绘画对历史神话和宗教题材的执念，他们把目光转向了日常，转向了此刻，转向了光。塞尚也参与了这场运动。1874年，他参加了在摄影师纳达尔工作室举办的第一届印象派展览。然而，评论界和大众的反应对他来说格外残酷。其他印象派画家至少受到了一些关注，哪怕是负面的。塞尚的作品被批评得体无完肤。有评论家说，他的作品像是用泥巴随手涂抹出来的。有人说他根本不懂透视，不懂构图，不懂任何画画应该懂的东西。但是在那些嘲笑声中，塞尚的内心却渐渐清晰起来。他开始意识到，印象派虽然美丽，虽然革命，但它缺少了某种根本性的东西。印象派捕捉的是瞬间，是光影在1秒钟里的变换，是感官在一个呼吸之间的印象。这固然迷人，但也太飘忽，太短暂，太像一阵风，抓不住，留不下。塞尚想要的是更永恒的东西，他想找到自然背后那个不变的骨架，那个支撑着万事万物的结构秩序。他说，他的目标是要用印象派的方式，重新把博物馆里那些古老大师的厚重与永恒找回来。这是一个极其宏大的野心，也是一条极其孤独的道路。1882年之后，塞尚几乎完全隐居在艾克斯。他不再频繁地去巴黎周旋于艺术圈的人际关系，他回到那个他既熟悉又陌生的南方小城，把所有的精力都灌注到画布上。他每天早早起床，收拾好画具，走向那座名叫圣维克多山的石灰岩山丘。那座山从艾克斯的任何一个地方都能看见，在天际线上沉默而巨大。塞尚把那座山画了将近90次，春天的山，夏天的山，清晨的山，黄昏的山。从远处看，从近处看，从不同的高度看，从不同的位置看，每一次光线都不同，季节都不同，但山还是那座山。他在探索的不是山的外貌，不是山的美丽，他在探索的是人眼看见一座山这件事本身的深层秘密。他问的问题是，当我们看见一个物体，我们到底在看什么？我们是在看它的颜色，它的轮廓，它此刻的样子，还是在看它背后永恒不变的那个结构本质？塞尚观察自然的方式与任何前人都截然不同。传统的学院派画家追求的是精确的几何透视和理想化的完美比例，印象派的画家追求的是捕捉光与色彩在某一个瞬间的真实感受。但塞尚却走向了另一个方向，他开始把眼前的自然世界有意识地拆解成最基本的几何形态：球体、圆柱体、圆锥体。这3个形状是他留给后世最著名的那句话的核心。他在给年轻画家埃米尔·贝尔纳的信中说，要用球体、圆柱体和圆锥体来处理自然。这句话后来成了整个20世纪现代艺术的钥匙。这句话被毕卡索读到，被马蒂斯读到，被无数年轻艺术家读到。每一个读到这句话的人都在里面看见了一个全新的世界。他的静物画，尤其是那些一再出现的苹果，让人百看不厌。桌上的苹果，一个个不是精致的装饰品， 而是像小星球一样浑圆诚实，充满了重量和密度。桌布的褶皱不只是布料的自然垂落，而是山丘一般起伏，每一条皱褶都带着张力。而那张桌子，如果你仔细看，会发现它似乎同时从好几个不同的角度被观看。桌子的左半边和右半边好像不是完全水平的同一个平面。这个现象在艺术史上有个名字，叫做多视点透视。传统的西方绘画遵循的是单点透视，就是从一个固定的位置往一个固定的消失点看。塞尚却把多个观看位置融合在同一个画面里。他不是在欺骗眼睛，他是在诚实的呈现人眼观看一个物体时，其实会从多个微小的角度移动这个事实。这个发现正是后来立体主义最核心的思想根源。巴勃罗·毕卡索和乔治·布拉克后来就是从塞尚的这个突破出发，他们把塞尚的几何分解思维推向了更极端的方向，把一个物体从四面八方同时展开，铺陈在同一个画面上。立体主义诞生了。野兽派的亨利·马蒂斯深受塞尚对色彩结构的启发，抽象表现主义和结构主义还有现代建筑理论都能在塞尚的思想里找到源头。一个人就这样悄悄地在南法一座小城的画室里打开了整个20世纪艺术的大门。然而在这一切发生的过程中，塞尚所体验到的几乎只有孤独。1886年发生了2件对塞尚影响深远的事情。第一件是父亲去世，留给他一大笔遗产。这对塞尚而言既是解脱也是复杂的。从那时起，他再不需要为金钱感到焦虑，可以完全自由地投入绘画。这笔遗产客观上让他有了继续探索的资本。第二件事对他的打击要深得多。就在同一年，他的老友左拉出版了一部小说，书名叫做《杰作》。故事的主角是一个充满天才光芒却最终在自我怀疑中走向毁灭的画家。那个画家很多人一眼就认出，原型正是保罗·塞尚。塞尚沉默了很长时间，然后他给左拉写了一封信。信的语气非常平静，几乎没有任何指责，只是说收到了书，说了几句感谢，然后在信的末尾用一个简单的再见结束了。那是他们最后一次通信。2个在田野间一起长大的少年，2个曾经对着星空畅谈未来的挚友，就这样在沉默中画上了句号。失去左拉之后，塞尚更加隐遁。他在艾克斯郊外的雷德布望见了一间正式的画室。那间画室坐落在一个山坡上，光线透过高大的窗户倾泻进来，照亮了满地的画布和静物。他的日常是极度规律的，固定的起床时间，固定的作画路线，固定的休息和饮食。他的世界越缩越小，却在内部越来越深邃。他的孤僻在艾克斯已经是出了名的传说。他极度不喜欢被人触碰，哪怕只是一个普通的握手，都让他感到不安。据说有一次，一位热情的邻居不小心碰了他的手臂，他几乎整个人崩溃，当场发作。他的情绪起伏巨大，他的脾气让很多人望而却步。对陌生人，他几乎不知道怎么正常的交流。但是当他站在画布前，他就变成了另一个人。那个暴躁敏感笨拙的塞尚消失了，留下来的是一个有着无限耐心无限专注的探索者。他可以对着同一组静物坐上100个小时，反复的看，反复的画，反复的修改。他曾为一位老农民画肖像，总共画了100多次，那个农民几乎快被他折磨疯了。他的要求是对方必须像苹果一样静止不动。他说，苹果不会动，所以苹果比人更好画。如果坐姿稍微偏移了一点，就必须一切重来。他的晚年肖像系列有一种其他任何画家都难以复制的沉静和厚重。他的御者系列是他晚年投入时间和精力最多的庞大计划。那些在水边沐浴的人物，身体被简化成弧线和块体，与背景的树木和天空融为一体。他花了将近20年，反复修改这组大型构图。他知道他在做的事情远远超出了自己一生所能完成的范畴，但他还是继续做。1900年之后，塞尚的名声开始在年轻一代画家中悄悄流传。 他们从巴黎出发，长途跋涉来到艾克斯，只为了见一眼这个传说中的隐士。有些人在他画室外等候了很久，才得到短暂的接见。他们带走的不只是一段记忆，而是整个改变了他们艺术方向的震撼。1901年，年轻的画家们在秋季沙龙中集体向塞尚致敬。他们把自己的展间称为塞尚展间，在里面悬挂向他致敬的作品。1904年，秋季沙龙为他举办了个人展览。1905年，经纪人安布鲁瓦斯·佛拉尔德为他举办了更大规模的展览。那次展览让更广泛的观众第一次真正看见了塞尚的艺术。塞尚曾在信中说，他每天都在进步，但他想要达到的那个目标，感觉永远还有很长的距离。这种对自我永不满足的追求，贯穿了他整个艺术生涯的始终。他毁掉了大量自己认为不够好的作品。他的助手约阿西姆加斯凯有时会悄悄把他打算销毁的画藏起来，否则后人可能会失去更多珍贵的塞尚。1906年10月，塞尚在户外写生时，遭遇了一场突如其来的暴风雨。他在田野中倒下，在冷雨中躺了很久，才被人发现，送回家中。几天后，他的病情急转直下。1906年10月22日，保罗塞尚安静地离开了这个世界，享年67岁。他死后的第2年，巴黎秋季沙龙举办了他的大型回顾展，整整56幅作品第一次完整地呈现在世人面前。那场展览震惊了整个艺术界，许多人走进展场，却在里面站了很久，久到忘了时间。他们第一次真正看见了塞尚的艺术道路，看见了那个宏大而超前无比清醒的视野。年轻的毕卡索在展览中站了很久，看了又看。他后来说，塞尚是他唯一真正的老师。马蒂斯说，塞尚就像是我们所有人的父亲。塞尚去世了，但他的影响才正要真正开始。塞尚做到了一件在艺术史上极为罕见的事，他把绘画从再现自然的义务中解放了出来。在塞尚之前，一幅画无论风格如何，都至少还是在努力再现某种视觉现实。在塞尚之后，绘画可以成为一种纯粹的思考形式，一种对空间和结构本身的探索。这扇门一旦被他打开，就再也无法关上。当我们今天站在美术馆里，看着毕卡索和马蒂斯和蒙德里安，看着那些让人既困惑又着迷的现代艺术作品，我们应该记得，那一切都有一个起点。那个起点是一座南法小城，一间光线充足的画室，和一个孤独的老人，一次又一次耐心地盯着桌上的那些苹果。那些苹果不只是水果，那是一种哲学，一种对观看这件事本身的深刻沉思。那些苹果沉甸甸地躺在那里，浑圆而充实，像是藏着宇宙的重量。塞尚说过，时间会流逝，但构成我们本质的那些东西会留下来。他的苹果至今仍在。塞尚用一生的孤独换来了后世的光明。他没有学生，没有学派，没有任何正式的传承，但他的作品成了20世纪每一个认真思考绘画的人都必须面对的挑战。当你真正站在一幅塞尚原作前，你会感受到一种奇妙的重量。那不只是颜料，那是一个人一生的凝视。我们下次见咯。Hello everyone, I am Jenny. Welcome to Thinker J. There is a man who spent most of his life living in the shadow of failure. He was rejected by the Paris Salon more than 20 times. His closest childhood friend, the celebrated novelist Emile Zola, published a novel that many people believe depicted him as a gifted but ultimately broken and unsuccessful painter. Back in his hometown of Aix-en-Provence, the neighbors considered him eccentric, even unhinged. For most of his working life, he existed in near total obscurity, dismissed by critics, overlooked by collectors, and largely ignored by the public. And yet this very man, just 1 year after his death, left the entire Paris art world standing speechless. This very man was called by Pablo Picasso the father of all modern painters. This very man, through decades of solitary work with a simple apple and a limestone mountain, fundamentally altered the entire direction of Western art history. His name was Paul Cézanne. Today our story begins in a sun-soaked town in the south of France. It is a story about patience and solitude, about the courage to keep working when the world offers nothing but silence, and about what happens when a single painter refuses to look at the world the way everyone else is looking at it. Paul Cézanne was born on January 19, 1839, in the city of Aix-en-Provence. It was a Mediterranean city of extraordinary, almost aggressive light. Limestone hills rolled across the horizon in every direction. Lavender scented the warm air, and the dry summer sun struck every rock and every leaf with sharp, clarifying intensity. That quality of light, so different from the softer, more diffuse light of Paris or the north, became a permanent and essential part of his inner world. His father, Louis-Auguste Cézanne, was a self-made man in every sense. He had started out as a hat merchant and had worked his way up through the commercial life of the region, eventually becoming a co-founder of a local financial institution. He was a practical man, clear-eyed about money and about what the world rewarded. He had firm expectations for his son. He wanted Paul to study law, to enter a respectable profession, and to establish himself solidly in society. But Paul, from his earliest years, showed a fundamentally different temperament. He was drawn to drawing, to wandering outdoors in the landscape, to perceiving the world through his eyes and his senses rather than through balance sheets or legal arguments. The young Paul Cézanne was already living in a world of images and light, even before he had the vocabulary to describe it. During his years at the Bourbon School, Cézanne met the person who would, in a very real sense, change the entire shape of his life. That person was Emile Zola. Zola would eventually go on to become one of the most important novelists in all of French literary history. But at the moment they met, they were simply two adolescent boys navigating the stone-paved streets of Aix together. Their friendship was immediate and ran surprisingly deep. They shared a similar restlessness, a similar sensitivity to beauty, and a similar burning ambition. They recited the poetry of Virgil by the riverbank, chased each other through open fields, and talked late into summer evenings about going to Paris one day and making their mark on the world. That boyhood friendship became the warmest and most uncomplicated period of what would become a long, difficult, and largely solitary life. But happiness changes. Zola left Aix for Paris in 1858, following his widowed mother. Cézanne remained behind, continuing his studies under his father's strict direction. The two friends kept their connection alive entirely through letters. Those early letters crackle with youthful energy, poetry, jokes, elaborate fantasy, and an almost endless longing for the future. In 1859, his father compelled him to enroll in law school at the University of Aix. Cézanne complied without visible protest. He sat in lecture halls studying civil procedure and Roman law while filling every available blank margin in his textbooks with small drawings. His eyes followed the professor across the room while his mind was elsewhere entirely. The compulsion to paint was like a geological force working underground, invisible but irresistible, slowly building toward the surface. The letters arriving from Zola in Paris acted like a series of lit flames. Zola wrote about the cafes where writers argued into the night, about the great salon exhibitions, about the collision of new ideas in every direction. Those descriptions made Cézanne deeply restless. He wanted to be there, not studying contracts and property law in a provincial classroom. Finally, in 1861, with the quiet and patient support of his mother, Cézanne persuaded his father to allow him to go to Paris. His father possibly calculated that a strong dose of rejection would cure his son of these impractical artistic ambitions once and for all. So at the age of 22, carrying his canvases and his enormous, barely articulable ambition, Paul Cézanne boarded the coach to Paris. Paris, however, was not welcoming. He applied to the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts, the most important art school in France, and was rejected. He sought out established teachers and received mostly polite indifference. He submitted work to exhibitions and was turned away, again and again. Paris was beautiful and utterly merciless, and it had very little patience for a rough-edged young man from the provinces who painted with too much paint and too much intensity and not nearly enough academic finesse. That autumn, a deeply discouraged Cézanne made his way back to Aix. His father almost certainly felt a quiet satisfaction. But Cézanne had not surrendered to the idea of failure, not really. He converted a small outbuilding on the family estate into a makeshift studio and kept on working, alone, in the warm southern light. He read, he thought, he experimented repeatedly, he failed repeatedly, and he tried again. In 1862, he returned to Paris. This time, he made a different choice. Instead of pursuing the official academies and their rigid hierarchies, he enrolled at the Académie Suisse, an open and informal studio where artists of every background and level could come to draw and paint from live models, to observe each other at work, and to exchange ideas freely. There, in that open and democratic space, he encountered Camille Pissarro. Pissarro was one of the central and most generous figures in the Impressionist movement. He was 10 years older than Cézanne, considerably more settled in his own direction, and unusually perceptive about the work of others. While many artists in Paris laughed openly at the thick, heavy, labored surfaces in Cézanne paintings, Pissarro looked more carefully. He saw something beneath the roughness, something that felt like genuine force. He recognized a real and serious intelligence behind the apparent awkwardness. His recognition meant more to Cézanne than any official prize could have. Under the mentorship and company of Pissarro, Cézanne began working outdoors in a more sustained and deliberate way. He learned to respond directly to natural light, to actual color in actual conditions, rather than to the predetermined formulas of academic painting. Pissarro took him to paint in the fields and along the riverbanks around Pontoise, and the two men worked side by side, each following his own path. Those painting sessions together were one of the most important catalysts in the entire history of Cézanne artistic development. In the 1870s, Impressionism exploded across the Parisian art world like a genuine revolution. Claude Monet was catching light dissolving over water at specific moments of the day. Pierre-Auguste Renoir was painting sun-warmed crowds full of movement and color and laughter. Alfred Sisley was following the trembling of reflections in rivers. These young painters had broken decisively with centuries of devotion to historical, mythological, and religious subjects. They turned their attention to the contemporary world, to the present moment, to the raw experience of seeing. Cézanne participated in this movement, at least in part. In 1874, he joined the first Impressionist exhibition, held in the studio of the photographer known as Nadar. But the critical response to his work was especially harsh. While other Impressionists attracted attention, even if negative and even mocking, Cézanne was frequently treated as simply incompetent. Some critics wrote that his paintings looked as though they had been applied with a trowel by someone who had never troubled to look at what he was doing. Others dismissed him as someone who fundamentally did not understand how painting worked. Yet inside Cézanne, through all that noise and dismissal, something was gradually becoming clear. He was beginning to understand, with increasing certainty, that Impressionism, for all its beauty and all its revolutionary energy, was missing something he considered fundamental. Impressionism caught the instant, the particular shimmer of light across a water surface in a single moment, the sensation registered in a single breath or a single heartbeat. That was genuinely beautiful. But it was also fugitive, unstable, like perfume that fills a room briefly and then is gone. Cézanne wanted something more lasting. He wanted to find and articulate the permanent underlying architecture of nature, the structural order that supports and organizes all visible things even when the light changes and the seasons turn. He described his ambition as wanting to redo nature the way the great old masters had done it, to create something solid and enduring out of the Impressionist method, something with the weight and permanence of the greatest paintings in museums. This was an enormous ambition. And it was a road he would have to walk largely alone. After 1882, Cézanne withdrew from the social and professional life of Paris almost completely. He returned to the south, to the city that had formed him and that he had always felt somewhat uneasy in. He poured everything he had into the canvas. Every morning he rose early, gathered his equipment, and walked toward the great limestone ridge known as Mont Sainte-Victoire. That mountain dominated the view from Aix in every direction, a massive and permanent presence on the horizon. He painted it nearly 90 times across the years. In spring light, in summer heat, in the cool blue mornings of winter. From far away, from close up, from elevated positions, from low along the road. Each session the light was different. Each season brought different colors to the rock and the sky. But the mountain itself remained entirely, immovably itself. What he was pursuing had nothing to do with capturing the picturesque beauty of a landscape. He was pursuing the deepest possible secret of what it means to see. He was asking a question that no painter before him had asked in quite this way. When the human eye rests on an object, what is it actually perceiving? Is it perceiving color and surface and the particular appearance of things in this specific moment? Or is it reaching past all of that toward something more fundamental, something structural, something that stays constant beneath all the variations of light and weather and time? Cézanne approached the visible world in a way that was genuinely unprecedented. The classical academic tradition pursued precise geometric perspective and idealized proportions, aiming to produce images that looked more perfect and more rational than anything you would actually encounter. The Impressionists pursued the direct sensory impression, the flicker of light on a surface in this exact moment, the truth of immediate perception. But Cezanne was doing something different from either tradition. He was deliberately breaking down everything he saw into its most fundamental geometric constituents. To understand what Cezanne was actually doing with those geometric ideas, it helps to spend some time with a specific painting. Look at his series of works simply known as the Card Players, which he produced in several versions during the early 1890s. In the most famous version, two men sit across a table from each other, deeply absorbed in their game. The painting contains almost no unnecessary detail. The figures are reduced to their essential volumes, their hats and jackets rendered as simplified geometric masses. Yet the whole composition radiates a kind of gravity and permanence that makes it feel less like a genre scene and more like a monument. That combination of simplification and depth is entirely characteristic of the mature Cezanne. Consider also the series of works known as the Large Bathers, which he worked on in 3 large versions across the final decade of his life. In these paintings, groups of nude figures are arranged in the landscape, beneath arching trees, near or beside water. The bodies are not idealized in the classical sense. They are simplified, geometrized, almost architectural. Their limbs echo the shapes of the branches above them. Their rounded forms rhyme with the curves of the landscape. The separation between figure and ground, between body and nature, begins to dissolve. What Cezanne was creating in those compositions was not a classical nude study. He was exploring the fundamental structural relationship between the human body and the natural world it inhabits. That exploration pointed directly toward the fully abstract art that would come in the decade after his death. Spheres, cylinders, cones. These 3 forms sit at the center of his most famous statement. In a letter to the young painter Émile Bernard, he wrote that one should treat all of nature through the sphere, the cylinder, and the cone. That sentence, written in a private letter from a relatively unknown painter in the south of France, would eventually become the key that unlocked the entire 20th century in Western art. Picasso read it. Matisse read it. Braque read it. Hundreds of young artists read it. And every single one of them found inside it the seed of an entirely new world. His still life paintings, especially his long ongoing series of apples, are among the most intellectually compelling works in the entire history of Western painting. The apples that appear again and again on his tables are not decorative props. They sit on their surfaces like small dense planets, perfectly round, heavy with a physical presence that seems almost gravitational. The folds of his tablecloths do not simply fall in the natural way that cloth falls. They rise like mountain ridges and descend like valleys, every crease loaded with structural tension. And if you look carefully at the tables themselves, you will begin to notice something genuinely unsettling. The left side and the right side of the table do not always appear to belong to quite the same perfectly horizontal plane. The table seems to be viewed simultaneously from 2 slightly different positions. This is what later art historians came to call multiple viewpoint perspective. Traditional Western painting from the Renaissance onward had been organized around single-point perspective. The viewer occupies a single fixed position looking toward a single vanishing point on the horizon. Cezanne was fusing several simultaneous viewpoints into a single pictorial surface. He was not being careless or incompetent, as his early critics assumed. He was actually being more rigorously honest than conventional perspective allowed. He was acknowledging the real fact that the human eye, as it studies an object carefully and attentively, makes dozens of continuous tiny adjustments in position. Single-point perspective had always been a convenient fiction. Cezanne refused the fiction. That refusal was the direct and immediate ancestor of Cubism. Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque both acknowledged explicitly that they departed from precisely this breakthrough in Cezanne. They pushed the logic of geometric decomposition and simultaneous multiple viewpoint to its most extreme possible conclusion, unfolding a single object from every possible direction simultaneously onto one flat surface. Out of that extension of Cezanne thinking, Cubism was born. Henri Matisse and the painters associated with Fauvism drew deeply from Cezanne's structural approach to color as an organizing and constructive element. The pioneers of abstract expressionism traced their spiritual and intellectual lineage directly back to him. Even the structural thinking underlying modern architecture and design owes debts to the same family of ideas. One solitary man, working in a modest studio in a small southern city, had quietly pushed open the door to the entire art of the 20th century. The impact of Cezanne on Picasso alone would be sufficient to guarantee him a permanent place in art history. When Picasso painted the work called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon in 1907, just 1 year after Cezanne's death, he was working directly through ideas he had absorbed from the Cezanne retrospective. The fractured, angular bodies in that painting, the way the surface of the canvas seems to simultaneously present multiple viewpoints at once, the refusal of conventional perspective, all of these owe an enormous debt to the older painter from Aix. But the influence extended far beyond Picasso. The painter Paul Gauguin, who was one generation younger than Cézanne and working in a very different direction, acknowledged that Cézanne had shown him something fundamental about the relationship between color and structure. The sculptor and painter Fernand Léger said that everything he understood about volume in a two-dimensional surface came from studying Cézanne. The Russian painter Kazimir Malevich, who would eventually strip painting down to pure geometric abstraction, traced his own path back through Cézanne. Even the great American abstract painters of the mid-20th century, figures like Arshile Gorky and Jackson Pollock, regarded Cézanne as a foundational source. The influence was not only on painters. The architect Le Corbusier was deeply shaped by the geometric structural thinking that Cézanne had articulated. The idea that architecture could be understood as the pure and disciplined play of volumes and planes assembled in light, which became one of the central ideas of modern architecture, resonates strongly with everything Cézanne had been doing in paint. But through almost all of this long process, what Cézanne actually experienced was very close to complete loneliness. During these years of withdrawal, Cézanne also began to work more intensively on his portraits. He made a famous and extensive series of self-portraits, perhaps 30 of them across his working life. Those self-portraits have a quality of unflinching honesty. He does not flatter himself in them, does not present himself as dramatic or romantic. He studies himself with the same dispassionate structural attention he applied to his apples and his mountain. The face that looks out from those canvases is heavy and serious, marked by thought and stubbornness and something that might be a deeply private grief. He also made extended portrait series of his wife Hortense Fiquet, whom he had been with since 1869 and married in 1886. Their relationship was complicated and not warm in any demonstrative way. Hortense later said that Cézanne had no real interest in anything except painting. He made her sit for him more than 27 times across many years. The portraits of Hortense show a woman of strong features rendered with the same geometric simplification and structural weight that characterizes all his mature work. In 1886, two events reshaped his external circumstances in very different ways. The first was the death of his father, who left him a substantial and genuinely life-changing inheritance. This was a liberation and a complication at the same moment. He no longer needed to worry about financial survival. He could paint entirely on his own terms, funded by the wealth his father had spent a lifetime building. That material freedom was not something he had ever had before, and it allowed him to work with a completeness and a single-mindedness he could not have sustained otherwise. The second event of 1886 cut far more deeply and personally. That same year, his old friend Zola published the novel called The Masterpiece. The novel centers on a painter of brilliant and unmistakable talent who ultimately cannot fully realize his vision and collapses under the accumulated weight of his own failure and self-doubt. The portrait was recognizable to many people who knew both men. The failed painter in the novel bore enough resemblance to Cézanne that many contemporaries drew the connection immediately, and Cézanne himself saw it. He sat with that recognition for some time. Then he wrote Zola a letter. The tone of the letter was almost eerily calm. He thanked Zola for sending the book, said a few quiet things, and offered nothing that could be called an accusation or a reproach. At the end of the letter, he wrote simply, "Goodbye." That single word concluded their correspondence. That was their last contact of any kind. Two boys who had grown up running through the same fields, two young men who had dreamed the same impossible dreams under the same southern stars, parted in silence and never spoke again. After that rupture, Cézanne retreated even further into himself and his work. He built a proper and well-equipped studio on a hillside outside Aix, in a district called Les Lauves. Natural light poured through tall north-facing windows onto a stone floor covered in canvases and still life arrangements. His daily life became radically and deliberately regular. Fixed waking hour, fixed routes walked at fixed times, fixed rhythms of work and rest. His world grew smaller on the outside and deeper on the inside. His reclusiveness had become a local legend in Aix by this point. He found physical contact with other people genuinely distressing, even in its most ordinary and casual forms. It is said that when an overly enthusiastic acquaintance once clapped him heartily on the shoulder in greeting, Cézanne reacted with a severity and agitation that alarmed everyone present. His emotional volatility, his sudden rages, his fierce sensitivity kept nearly everyone at a cautious distance. He was not easy to be around. He knew it and did not seem to know quite how to change it. But in front of the canvas, the man transformed entirely. The difficult, brittle, unapproachable figure that the people of Aix knew as their strange neighbor ceased to exist. In his place stood a figure of inexhaustible patience and total unwavering concentration. He could work before the same arrangement of objects for 100 hours or more, looking, painting, looking again, revising again, questioning everything he had done. He made a local farmer named Valère sit as a model for his portrait across more than 100 separate sessions. The farmer endured the experience with remarkable stoicism. Cézanne required complete stillness, the kind of absolute stillness that an apple naturally possesses. He reportedly said that if the pose changed by even the smallest fraction, everything had to begin again from the very beginning. His late portrait paintings carry a quality of immovable quiet dignity that is unlike almost anything else in Western art. The series known as the Card Players, which he worked on through the early 1890s, achieves a monumental gravity that seems to come from some place beyond ordinary painting. His Bathers series was the most ambitious sustained project of his final years. The figures near the water are reduced to large simplified volumes and curving arcs, merging structurally with the trees and the sky that surround them. He worked on those large compositions for nearly 2 decades, revising them without satisfaction, feeling that he was still not quite reaching what he was after. He knew that what he was attempting was larger in scope than what a single lifetime could fully achieve. But he kept going forward. After 1900, his name began moving quietly and then more rapidly through the networks of younger painters in Paris. They came from Paris to Aix in small groups, making what amounted to artistic pilgrimages, to find this legendary hermit and to look with their own eyes at the work that was beginning to change how painting was understood. Some of them waited for hours outside his studio before being granted even a brief encounter. What they carried back with them was not a souvenir but a fundamental reorientation of everything they had previously understood about the possibilities of painting. In 1901, a group of younger painters at the Salon de Independence devoted an entire room to work made in direct homage to Cézanne. In 1904, the Salon d'Automne gave him a dedicated room in the exhibition for the first time. In 1905, the dealer Ambroise Vollard organized a significant exhibition of his work that introduced him to far wider audiences than he had previously reached. Recognition was arriving at last, slowly and incompletely, but unmistakably and without possibility of reversal. Cézanne wrote in a letter toward the end of his life that he was making progress every single day, but that the goal he had set himself still seemed to remain just beyond his reach, retreating as he advanced. That restless and self-demanding quality animated his entire working life from beginning to end. He destroyed enormous numbers of his own paintings when he judged them insufficient. His assistant, Joaquin Gasquet, would sometimes quietly remove and set aside works that Cézanne was preparing to ruin or discard entirely, preserving them for a future audience that Cézanne himself never fully believed would exist. Without that quiet act of preservation, the world would know far fewer of his paintings today. In October 1906, Cézanne was caught outdoors by a sudden and violent storm while working on a landscape. He collapsed in the open field and lay in the driving rain for some time before being discovered and helped home. His condition deteriorated over the following days with alarming speed. On October 22, 1906, Paul Cézanne died quietly at his home in Aix-en-Provence. He was 67 years old. 1 year after his death, the Salon d'Automne in Paris mounted a major retrospective exhibition of his work. 56 paintings were shown together for the first time, laid out to reveal the full scope and ambition of what he had been doing across the decades. The exhibition stopped the art world in its tracks. People walked in and did not leave quickly. They stood before the paintings for a long time, sometimes in silence, sometimes in low urgent conversation. For the first time, the full arc of his artistic journey was visible, and the enormous and quiet and absolutely deliberate vision that had animated it became unmistakable. Young Pablo Picasso spent a long time in those rooms and later said that Cézanne was his one true teacher, the father of all of them. Matisse said that Cézanne was like the father of us all. Georges Braque, speaking decades later, said that Cézanne had been the first to break the tension, the first to begin what all of them had only continued. Cézanne had accomplished something that is genuinely rare in the history of art. He had liberated painting from its long-standing obligation to reproduce the visible world. Before Cézanne, a painting in whatever style was always, at some level, reaching toward visual representation, toward some version of what the eye actually encounters. After Cézanne, painting could become something entirely different, a pure form of thought, a direct and autonomous exploration of space and structure as subjects in themselves, independent of any natural model. The door he pushed open through decades of solitary work has never been closed. Before we go deeper into those final years, it is worth stepping back to consider the physical act of Cézanne painting as a practice. The man worked with an intensity that was almost frightening to observe. He arrived at his motif, as he called it, at the first light of dawn. He set up his easel with the care and deliberateness of someone preparing for a serious ritual. He then began to look. The looking came before the painting. He could stand or sit before a subject for very long stretches of time without touching the brush at all, simply looking, simply receiving, trying to understand what he was actually seeing rather than what he expected to see. This quality of looking, this willingness to stay with a subject until it began to reveal its deeper organization, was what separated him from nearly every other painter of his generation. Most painters, even very good ones, look quickly and then begin to translate what they have seen into the familiar conventions of their medium. Cézanne refused the conventions and kept looking until the subject showed him something the conventions could not contain. He was also, it must be said, a painter who suffered enormously from doubt. The letters of his later years are full of expressions of uncertainty, of the feeling that he had not yet achieved what he had set out to achieve, that the goal was always receding just beyond his reach. He wrote repeatedly about the difficulty of realizing his sensations in paint, about the gap between what he perceived and what he was able to put on canvas. Some people have read those letters as evidence of a man defeated by his own ambitions. But there is another way to read them. The gap between what Cézanne perceived and what he could achieve in paint was also the engine that kept him working. It was the source of the restlessness and the dissatisfaction that made him revise, destroy, and begin again. A painter who felt that he had achieved everything he set out to achieve would simply stop. Cézanne never stopped. There is something worth pausing over in the sheer improbability of the Cézanne story. Here is a man who received almost no recognition during the most productive decades of his working life. He was rejected by the official institutions, dismissed by the critics, and largely ignored by the art-buying public. He worked in near isolation in a provincial city, producing painting after painting in conditions of almost complete obscurity. And yet the paintings accumulated. The vision deepened and sharpened with every passing year. He never stopped asking the same fundamental question, never stopped pushing toward the same impossible goal. There is a lesson in that persistence that extends far beyond the world of painting. Cézanne did not compromise his vision in order to please the salon or satisfy the critics. He did not shift toward a more commercially appealing style when his work was rejected. He did not seek validation from institutions that he had come to understand were looking at painting through entirely the wrong set of assumptions. He simply kept working, alone, at the level of depth and seriousness that the work demanded. That combination of absolute self-trust and absolute self-criticism, the willingness to reject his own work when it fell short of his standard even as he refused to accept the rejection of his broader vision by the world, is one of the most unusual and powerful qualities in the entire history of modern art. It is also worth noting how deeply rooted in a specific place and a specific quality of light his art was. Cézanne is almost inseparable from Provence, from Aix, from the particular way the Mediterranean sun strikes limestone at different hours of the day. He left Paris behind not only because he found the social world of the capital exhausting and uncongenial, but because he needed that specific light, that specific air, that specific mountain. The paintings could only have been made there, by that particular person, in those particular conditions. There is something in that rootedness that the greatest art often displays, a willingness to go very deep into one particular place and one particular set of problems rather than ranging widely and more superficially across many things. Cézanne went deep. He went very, very deep. And what he found in the depths has shaped how every painter since has understood the possibilities of paint on canvas. The story of how Cézanne was eventually received and celebrated is itself a significant piece of cultural history. For most of the 19th century, the official art world in France operated through a single institutional gateway, the Salon. The Salon was controlled by the Académie des Beaux-Arts, and the Academy had very definite ideas about what painting should look like, what subjects were appropriate, and what technical standards had to be met. Cézanne failed to meet the Salon criteria repeatedly and spectacularly. But the Salon criteria were themselves becoming obsolete. The Impressionist movement had already demonstrated that the official system could not contain the full range of what painting might become. And the generation that came after the Impressionists, the generation that included Cézanne at its center, demonstrated that painting was capable of asking questions so fundamental that the entire institutional framework built around art since the Renaissance would need to be rethought. Cézanne did not set out to overthrow any institution. He simply kept painting as honestly and as deeply as he could. But the paintings that resulted from that honesty were so radical in their implications that they did, in fact, overthrow everything. When the Great Retrospective opened in Paris in 1907, the year after his death, what struck the younger generation most powerfully was not any single painting but the overall logic of the enterprise. Seen as a whole, the work made a kind of argument. It said that painting did not have to reproduce the appearance of things. It said that painting could investigate the underlying structure of visual experience directly, without the mediation of conventional representation. It said that the canvas was not a window onto an imagined scene but a surface with its own laws and its own possibilities. These ideas had been latent in the work of others before Cézanne. But Cézanne had made them visible, had made them undeniable, had laid them out across 56 canvases in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. The argument was won. The door was open. Today, when we stand in contemporary museums looking at Picasso and Matisse, at Mondrian and the abstract expressionists, at all the movements and counter-movements and revolutions and reactions that constitute the art of the modern era, we are standing in a long corridor that leads back, no matter how indirectly, to one solitary man. That man worked in a modest studio in a small sun-drenched southern city. He rose early every morning and walked out to face the same mountain and the same light with the same inexhaustible, unsatisfied patience. He sat before a table covered in apples and looked at those apples as though looking was the most serious thing a person could do. Those apples are not merely fruit. They are a philosophy. They are a sustained meditation on the act of seeing itself. They sit heavily on their tables, dense and round and full of presence, filled with something that feels very much like the weight of the universe held perfectly still. Cézanne once wrote in a letter that time passes, but the things that truly constitute us remain. His apples are still with us. The apples Cézanne painted are in museums across the world now, in Paris and London and New York and Tokyo. People stand before them in quiet galleries, sometimes not quite able to articulate why these simple objects feel so serious and so full. The answer, if there is one, is that Cézanne looked at those apples more carefully and more completely than anyone had ever looked at anything before. And what he found in that looking changed everything. And his mountain is still there too, rising above Aix-en-Provence in the same sharp Mediterranean light that he looked at every morning for 20 years. Visitors still go to stand on the hillsides where he stood, to look at the same view he looked at, to try to understand through their own eyes what he was seeing when he saw it. The mountain has not changed. The light has not changed. But the way we see both of them, the way we see any object in any landscape anywhere, was permanently altered by one man who stood before that mountain with his easel and his paint and his inexhaustible patience and his absolute refusal to stop looking until he understood what looking was. See you next time.